It's a 3.5-hour delay.
They're at 4:30.
Why are you there at 4:30?
5:30.
No, the plane went and they took off around 10:50, like they got off the runway, like 10:50.
It's okay. We have lots of snacks just in case it happens again.
School on Monday. We get delayed.
And I have
I'm
homework.
going to school no matter what. I can't miss another day. I'm going to put one day on my little educational enrichment form.
Thing.
Are you just taking it as an excuse?
Judges, are you ready?
Ready.
This is Troy.
Team, are you ready?
Yes,
Yes.
ma'am.
You may begin.
Good morning. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the judges for giving us their time today. My name is Bailey Hatzel, and sitting next to me is Ben Berdichevsky, Sterling Rennick, and Abby Brodsky. We are students at the High School of Jewish Studies in Louisville, Kentucky. The case before us is as follows. One day, in awe of Rachel Rubenstein's vehicle struck Shimon Shalom's car in order to avoid striking a pedestrian. She programmed her new self-driving Aliva to the grocery store while she relaxed and listened to a podcast. While in transit, Ms. Rubenstein's vehicle crossed into oncoming traffic and blindsided Mr. Shalom's automobile, causing severe injury to him and substantial damage to his car. After recovering fully in the hospital, Mr. Shalom is bringing his case to this Beit Din. He is suing for full recompense, including time of his hospital stay, time away from work, and damages to his car. Ms. Rubenstein was initially apologetic towards Mr. Shalom, but argues that Aliva Industries is liable because the car is self-driving. She says that had she been in control of the vehicle, she would have slammed on the brakes and avoided collision. Because of this, she urges Mr. Shalom to seek damages from Aliva Industries, saying, after all, they're the ones who wrote the program that made the car swerve into yours. Upon hearing about Ms. Rubenstein's remarks, Mr. Levine explained that the nature of the car's programming is to minimize the risk of fatalities. The car acted according to its wiring to avoid killing the pedestrian, and Mr. Shalom's injury was an unfortunate collateral damage of the vehicle's programming, which prioritized pikuah nefesh, saving a life.
Mishnah Bava Kama 8.1 gives 5 categories that damage can fall under. There is damages, or nezek, time taken off of work, or shevet, medical expenses, ripui, embarrassment, or boshet, and suffering, or tsa'ar. Mr. Shalom is only requesting 3 of these. He is requesting nezek, shevet, and ripui to cover the damages to his car, the time he had to take off of work, and his medical expenses. He is not requesting boshet or tsa'ar. Before we award anything to Mr. Shalom, we first have to decide what the car is classified as, because in Talmudic times, there were no cars of any sort. To do this, we must find a similar parallel, which we can do using Mishnah Bava Kama 1.1. This gives us 4 different ways to class something that causes damage. There is the ox or shore, which is a living, moving animal that causes damage. There is the pit or the boar, which is a lifeless, non-moving object that causes damage. There is the chewer or maveh, which is a living animal that moves around while causing property damage. And there is fire, or aish, which is a non-living thing that causes damage while moving around. We have decided that the car is aish. The car is not the ox, because though it both move, the car is not alive. It is not the pit or boar, because the car caused damage while in motion, while the pit only causes damage while stationary. The car is unlike the chewer, because while the chewer moves and causes damage, the chewer only causes property damage, while the car caused damage to both Mr. Shalom and his car. Therefore, the car must be classified as fire or aish. The argument could be made that the car is in reality alive because it followed pikuah nefesh, or saving a life. However, due to Mr. Eli Levine's statement that the car is following its programming to minimize the risk of fatalities, we can see that the car would make the same decision again and again regardless. Any being that is truly living, even something that is as simple as an ox or a bug, can make a different decision if faced with the same set of circumstances. Because of this, we have decided that the car must be classified as aish under halachic law.
All the sources we read say that someone must pay for the damage fire causes. Shemot 22:5 states, when a fire is started and spreads the thorns, so that stacked, standing, or growing grain is consumed, he who started the fire must make restitution. Based on this verse, Rabbi Yochanan states, a person is liable for his fire because it is like his arrows. What Rabbi Yochanan means is that fire is like an arrow shot from a bow because it was started by a person but is no longer under their direct control. Based on this evidence, we have concluded that Ms. Rubenstein is liable to pay for nezek, shevet, and ripui, as requested by Mr. Shalom. She is liable because she set the fire when she chose to drive the car. Driving a car can be a dangerous activity comparable to setting a fire. She started the car and thus is liable for any damage it may cause. Ms. Rubenstein may attempt to argue that she was under duress. However, we have determined that she was not. Tosafot and Ramban define duress as an unusual or extraordinary situation. An example would be a knife falling from a roof in an uncommon gust of wind and harming someone. Ms. Rubenstein, however, knew how her car operates and still chose to use it. Furthermore, she was using the car with the intent that it was made for. Furthermore, Ms. Rubenstein was forewarned about the car's dangerous nature. We know this because Gemara Bava Kama 9b to 10a tells us that the setter of the fire, or in this case the car, is always forewarned. Again, this is especially relevant because she knew she was operating a car she could not control. As Bailey previously explained, Ms. Rubenstein was listening to a podcast at the time of the accident. However, this does not negate her liability because the Mishnah teaches that one is considered warned, i.e. fully liable, whether accidental or intentional, whether awake or asleep. We have also determined that Mr. Levine is not liable for any damages in this case. Ketubot 19a teaches that few things stand in the way of saving a life. As Ben just explained to us, Mr. Levine programmed his car to uphold Pekuach Nefesh, saving a life, and so he avoids liability in this case. Our decision rests on the assumption that Ms. Rubenstein's insurance will not attempt to collect the same payments from her a second time. This is because Rabbi Moshe Sternbach ruled that one should not be liable to pay twice for the same damage. If the insurance pays, Mr. Shalom is to return Rachel's payment to her.
The Beit Din has chosen not to find Mr. Levine liable in this case, but has made recommendations regarding the future programming of his car. The Gemara in Bava Kama 60b teaches in general that one cannot damage another's property to save oneself. Recommendations include an easier override system based on Ms. Rubenstein's claim that she would have slammed on the brakes had she been the one driving the vehicle, preventing the pedestrian and Mr. Shalom from being harmed. In addition to an easier override system, our Beit Din suggests the driver of the car be attentive while the vehicle is in use. If Mr. Levine implements the recommendations, he may avoid possible liability for future accidents, because he would be increasing the level of forewarning the driver receives and returning control of the car to the driver, making future buyers more responsible for accidents that occur when using the leva. Based on the resources provided and the facts presented in the case, the Beit Din awards Mr. Shalom full recompense, including damages to his car, medical expenses, and time off work. Ms. Rubenstein shall be liable for all possible damage caused by the vehicle. This is because the leva is classified by the Beit Din as being fire, due to the fact that the leva moves around, causes damage, and is not alive. Since Ms. Rubenstein set the fire by activating the car, she was forewarned. She is responsible for all damages caused, though the Beit Din has found Mr. Levine not liable for the damages he has been advised to alter the programming of the car by adding an easier override system and urged the driver of the car to be attentive while using the car to avoid possible liability for future accidents. Thank you again for your time.
Judges, you now have 8 minutes for questions.
So I can start us off, and Ben.
Yes.
Ben, one of your central arguments was that the said programming is the same over and over. However, a fire cannot make decisions, as this has been assigned to. So I'm not sure I agree with your statement then about the programming being the same again and again and attributing it to H. In this case, there is duress, and that the programming of which way to veer is under multiple parameters, including duress such as gust of winds or the number of passengers that happen to be on either side of different cars or even pedestrians in the street. So help me again. I'm not sure how your fact that the programming is the same again and again fits directly into this case.
So as I said, the programming would make the car do the same thing under the same set of circumstances. If there is a fire that is set in the same conditions over and over, the fire will do the same thing. If a certain branch is extremely dry, the fire will catch fire to that branch. If the same branch is extremely wet, it won't catch fire. It will do the same thing if you have it in the same set of circumstances, the same way the car will. We are not given enough explanation about the conditions the car was in. We don't know if it was a 2-lane street. We don't know if it was a 4-way highway. All we know is that the car deemed that the best option was to swerve into Mr. Shalom's car. This means that in the same set of circumstances, it would do the same way that a fire that has been set will go the same direction every time under the same set of circumstances.
I have a corollary question to what Judge Actor had to say. With the programming of the car, what we really did is to train the car to do certain things under certain circumstances. In the same way, you can train an ox to do certain things under certain circumstances. How can you train fire?
You can't train fire, just as you can't train the car.
So, just as what?
You can't train the car. The car does the same thing as the fire. Neither are trained.
And what is the basis for you saying that?
The car is programmed to do a certain thing. The fire will also do a certain thing. You know, we can guess what will happen, and the car, that's the car's being to do this thing. It is not living, and therefore it can't be an ox.
The car was programmed to do a certain thing, whereas the ox can be taught to do something. So the car's programming, once it has been sold to Ms. Rubenstein, is consistent every single day, whereas an ox, its training can be built upon.
So, you agree with me that you can't train fire?
Yes, you
Correct.
can't train fire.
The same way
You agree
we
with
can't
me
train the
that
car.
fire is not a mode of transportation?
Correct.
So if an ox is a mode of transportation and a fire is not, and fire cannot be trained, but an ox can, how different is that if you, in your training or the programming of the computer, you can't put in variables that address the same situation in a different way, depending on just something slightly different? In other words, I question whether you would have the same thing happening over and over again, because in the real world, things don't happen exactly the same over and over again.
Yeah, I think what you're asking is whether or not the car, even if there was a slight differentiation in the environment, whether it could make a different decision. And I don't think we are given the information to determine that, because Mr. Levine just says it was programmed to minimize the risk of fatalities, and he does not specify how it was programmed, so we can't really answer that question to the full extent.
It's pretty much like I asked before. I'm still just not entirely convinced that Rachel was not under duress, considering that there was no previous incidences of this happening. So then it seems like it was like a gust of wind. Because how could she have been forewarned if there had been no history that anything like this had taken place?
Because in the Gemara, as I previously explained, the setter of the fire is always forewarned, whether or not they are under duress. They're always forewarned, even if it is an accident, even if they are asleep. They are always forewarned since they set the fire, and we determined that Ms. Rubenstein set the fire, so she is going to be forewarned.
Perhaps Oliva Industries set the fire.
It can be argued that Oliva Industries set the fire, but it was as if they're going camping. Oliva Industries may have set up the campfire. They may have put the wood in place. They may have placed a tinder. But Ms. Rubenstein is the one who struck the match, and she's the one who lit the tinder and lit the fire.
And of course, my question to you is there anything in our materials and our sources that say, that give you the hint that electricity is fire or fire is electricity?
There's nothing in the sources that we saw that could conclude that, because in Talmudic times, they didn't even have the notion of electricity. They couldn't have foreseen something like this.
So you just make an assumption.
We have to compare it to what we know, and we have to conclude something from that.
So while we still have time, in your assumptions, the halachic damages of Tsar and Boshe are not in play because they're not being requested. Do you feel that there's an argument for suffering Tsar that could be based in these instances?
We're not awarding it because he didn't ask for it. In addition to this, we weren't given any sources that give us an ability to quantify suffering or embarrassment. Because of this, it is very difficult to say this is what he should receive in reparations for suffering. We don't know how to quantify that with the sources we have been provided.
Okay, but do you personally feel then, or based on the other arguments that Ms. Rubenstein would be responsible for suffering in this case?
I think that if Mr. Shalom felt that she was responsible, he would have requested it.
Thank you.
I have one other question.
Yes, sir.
So, you've said in your written statement that, that Aliva has no liability. How is it that the person or the company that puts a product into the marketplace that could be dangerous, because you're telling me that Mrs. Rubenstein knew it was dangerous, didn't Aliva know it was dangerous? So were they not forewarned, Aliva not forewarned, and therefore shouldn't Aliva be liable?
Yes, sir, I see what you're saying, but since we did classify the car as H, the Torah teaches that one who sets the fire must make restitution, and we have based our argument around that fact, and since we determined Ms. Rubenstein set the fire, she is the one liable in our case.
Time.
Go shake their hands, go shake their hands, go shake their hands.
We have 5 minutes until the next presentation. Eula, you may set up.
Okay, we're at